Welcome back. Hope everyone's doing well today. Today we'll look at the Battle of Rich Mountain. This was one of the Civil War's lesser known battles, and it occurred near Beverly, Virginia, presently West Virginia. The battle and its aftermath had a profound impact on the years that followed, as it elevated George McClellan to command of the Army of the Potomac and to General-in-Chief of all Union armies. Following the Battle of Philippi, the Confederates withdrew south to Beverly, then on to Huttonsville. There they would remain until General Robert Selden Garnett arrived with reinforcements to relieve Colonel Porterfield. Soon the Second Wheeling Convention convened on June the 11th, 1861. Arthur Borman of Wood County was chosen as president of the convention. The next day, proceedings were moved to the Custom House because of overcrowding at the initial meeting place of Washington Hall. At this point, the chief question facing the delegates was whether to, number one, proceed with the formation of a new state, or, number two, to reorganize the Virginia government. On June the 19th, the convention delegates voted unanimously in favor of the ordinance reorganizing the government of Virginia. The restored government of Virginia was born, with Francis Pierpont as governor. On June 15th, General Robert Garnett replaced Colonel Porterfield as commander of the Confederate forces in northwestern Virginia. Garnett immediately began to fortify Rich Mountain and Laurel Hill to protect a vital supply route from the Federals. The Staunton-Parkersburg Turnpike passed through the town of Beverly and between Rich Mountain and Laurel Hill. Here the road forked. The left fork led to Parkersburg on the Ohio River. The right fork, the Beverly-Fairmont Turnpike, followed a northwesterly route as it passed through Philippi and on to Grafton. The route to Grafton offered easy access to the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which also led to the Ohio River at Wheeling. Garnett placed 3,500 troops at Laurel Hill, the point where he expected an assault. Garnett then sent Colonel Jonathan M. Heck to fortify Rich Mountain. Heck entrenched at the western base of Rich Mountain. Garnett's position was well fortified and covered every approach to Laurel Hill. The Rich Mountain camp was named Camp Garnett in honor of the commanding general. There, breastworks on each side of the turnpike were constructed. The area in front of the breastworks was cleared in preparation for a frontal attack by the Federals and afforded a clear field of fire. Artillery was placed at the center of the line and on each flank. This afforded further protection against attack. Soon thereafter, Garnett sent the 20th Virginia, commanded by Colonel John Pegram, to reinforce Camp Garnett. Outranking Colonel Heck, Pegram assumed command at Camp Garnett. At his disposal was a force numbering 1,300 men. On June 23rd, General McClellan arrived at Grafton. McClellan, after numerous consultations, opted for a movement against Rich Mountain. On July the 9th, McClellan moved his base of operations to Roaring Creek Flats, indicated by the red star on this slide. This was 2 miles west of Camp Garnett. Then, McClellan sent General Thomas A. Morris to keep the Confederates occupied at Laurel Hill. From July 7th to July 11th, Morris's forces engaged in a series of minor skirmishes with Garnett's men in and around the small town of Belington. These battles, which became known as the Battle of Belington, although minor, accomplished the desired effect of keeping Garnett from reinforcing Pegram at Rich Mountain. Meanwhile, a young man appeared seeking permission to visit his father's home atop Rich Mountain. The young man was 22-year-old David Hart, son of Joseph Hart. Joseph Hart was a descendant of John Hart. Now, it's doubtful that many people know who John Hart was. So let's look. Now, I'm sure you all recognize this document. Let's zoom into the bottom. Let's zoom in a little bit more. As you can see, John Hart was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Now let's get back to David Hart. Hart was taken to General William S. Rosecrans, pictured here in the center, for interrogation. Hart told Rosecrans of an old road, hardly used, that would lead around the left flank of the Confederates into a dirt road a short distance from the Hart home. Rosecrans took this information along with Hart to General McClellan. It took some convincing, but McClellan finally agreed to Rosecrans' plan. At dawn, a brigade led by Colonel Frederick Lander, pictured here on the right, and composed of 1,900 Indiana and Ohio troops, stealthily left camp to march to the Hart farm. The march was extremely taxing, as the troops made their way through brush, thickets, and crossed ravines. To compound things, heavy rains fell from 6 that morning until 11 o'clock. The march had taken much longer than expected. The Federals, in fact, did not reach the dirt road that led to the Hart farm until shortly after 11 o'clock. As the column began moving along the dirt road, Rosecrans was unaware of two things. One, when McClellan had not heard the firing he expected, due to the long delay, McClellan became concerned and decided to recall the flank attack. He sent Sergeant David Wolcott of the 1st Ohio Cavalry to recall Rosecrans. Confederate pickets, however, captured Wolcott, and Rosecrans did not receive the message. 2. With Wolcott captured, Colonel Pegram knew the Federals were executing a flank march. The previous night, to guard against such a maneuver, Pegram had placed 2 companies near the summit, almost 2 miles to his rear, to fortify the position. When he learned of the Federal plans, he sent 2 more companies and an artillery piece to reinforce the summit. This increased the Confederate force to 300 men. This left Pegram with 1,000 men at Camp Garnett to face McClellan. Now, with 4,000 troops, McClellan could have easily overwhelmed Pegram. However, McClellan had heard cheers from the Confederates as they repulsed a Federal advance. McClellan then assumed that Rosecrans had been defeated, and he ordered his line back to Roaring Creek Flats. Meanwhile, Rosecrans' column, soon after passing the crest of the hill and about a quarter of a mile from the Hart farm, began to take fire from enemy pickets. The Federals commenced their attack. This illustration of the fighting appeared in Harper's Weekly on July 27th of 1861. Here the Confederates made their stand. They took shelter behind a stable and among large boulders. The lone Confederate cannon stood here near the Hart stable. The Confederates put up a gallant defense, driving back 2 Federal assaults. After 3 hours of fighting, the entire Federal line charged and captured the cannon. Confederates scattered through the woods. Rosecrans called off any pursuit to prepare for a counterattack. That counterattack never came. Colonel Pegram encountered the retreating men on his way to the Hart farm to check on the battle's progress. He tried to rally the men but was unsuccessful. As he rode to Camp Garnett, Pegram fell from his horse and suffered an injury. Pictured here is the location of the Hart home. A small monument marks the spot. Pictured here is the site of Camp Garnett. As you can see, the interpretive marker has been damaged, unfortunately, by vandals. When he arrived at the camp, Pegram consulted with his officers and, with Federals at his front and rear, decided to abandon Camp Garnett. However, due to his injury, Pegram relinquished command to Colonel Heck, who then issued orders for the retreat. It was a dark and rainy night as the column of retreating Confederates, led by Captain R.D. Lilly of the 25th Virginia and accompanied by mapmaker of the 25th Virginia, Jedediah Hotchkiss, they left camp just after midnight. Hotchkiss was destined to become one of Stonewall Jackson's chief aides. With no light, trail, or compass to guide him, Hotchkiss stepped into position at the head of the column and began to lead them down the mountain. He relied on his instincts and the flow of streams to point the column in the right direction. They made steady progress and eventually left the mountain without being discovered. Before the retreat was completed, Pegram, for some reason, decided to take command again. Word was sent up the line to halt the column until Pegram came to the front. However, the men led by Captain Lillian Hotchkiss never got the message and continued to Beverly. When learning of the Federals in the rear, Lilly continued the retreat through Huttonsville and on to Cheat Mountain. Hearing of the defeat at Rich Mountain, Garnett knew he was in a precarious position at Laurel Hill. Leaving his tents up and fires burning, Garnett quietly slipped away and moved south on the Parkersburg-Staunton Turnpike. When informed erroneously that the Federals blocked his path at Beverly, Garnett changed to a northeasterly route into the Cheat River Valley to avoid them. In moving towards Staunton, Garnett would encounter mountainous terrain, terrible roads. He had to cross and recross creeks and rivers. It was an extremely taxing march. Meanwhile, having resumed command, Pegram had led his column to a point 3 miles south of Leedsville, present-day Elkins. Here, Pegram received some disturbing news. Garnett had abandoned Laurel Hill. Pegram's troops were hungry, exhausted, and demoralized. He saw surrender as the only option. At midnight, Pegram sent the following message to McClellan. Sir, owing to the reduced and almost famished command of the troops under my command, I am compelled to offer to surrender them to you as prisoners of war. I have only to ask that they receive at your hands such treatment as Northern prisoners have invariably received from the South. McClellan responded with the following message to Pegram. Sir, your communication dated yesterday proposing to surrender as prisoners of war the force assembled under your command has been delivered to me. As commander of this department, I will receive you, your officers and men, as prisoners of war, but it is not my power to relieve you or them from any disabilities incurred by taking arms against the United States. McClellan then issued orders to deliver food and provisions to Pegram's famished command of 593 men, including 33 officers. Meanwhile, Garnett's ruse is discovered, and Morris begins his pursuit. On July 13, the Federals, under Colonel Henry Benham, pictured here on the right, finally caught up with the Confederates at Shaver's Fork of the Cheat River and began their attack. The conflict continued through the crossing at Corrick's Ford. Here, Garnett placed a battery along with the 23rd Virginia on high ground overlooking the ford. As Federals began crossing the ford, the 23rd opened fire. The 7th Indiana crossed the ford and charged the Confederate battery. The Southerners, low on ammunition, broke and ran. Upon seeing his men in retreat, Garnett attempted to rally them. On horseback, he made an inviting target, and it wasn't long before Garnett fell. He was the first general killed in the Civil War. A Federal honor guard conveyed the body under a flag of truce to his relatives, who buried the Garnett in Baltimore, Maryland. He was later reinterred next to his wife in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York. Now, to put the timeline in context, the Battle of First Bull Run occurred on July 21st, after the actions at Philippi, Rich Mountain, and Corrick's Ford. 9 days later, on July the 22nd, following the Union disaster at First Bull Run, McClellan was recalled to Washington, and General Rosecrans assumed command in Western Virginia. The actions at Philippi, Rich Mountain, Laurel Hill, and Corrick's Ford were instrumental in the decision to elevate McClellan to command of the Army of the Potomac and eventually to General-in-Chief of all Union armies. In addition, these events essentially ceded control of northwestern Virginia to Union forces for virtually the remainder of the war. Control of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and the Staunton-Parkersburg Turnpike by the Federals made it extremely difficult for Confederates to supply their units in western Virginia. Leaders meeting for the Wheeling Conventions could now breathe a bit easier, knowing that northwestern Virginia was under Union control. On August 20th, after lengthy debate, the convention adopted an ordinance to provide for the formation of a new state out of a portion of the territory of this state, and set October 24th, 1861, for a referendum by the voters. It would not be long before a new state was born. And that, my friends, is the story of Rich Mountain. If you're ever near Beverly, West Virginia, a stop at the Rich Mountain battlefield is well worth it. Makes a great day trip as well. Please join us next time when we look at some action in the Kanawha Valley. Until then, happy trails and God bless.